All right, we're finally back again. Honored to have Thomas Myrtle back again for episode 3 of Mysteries of Manitowoc. Thomas, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate you having me on as always, and hope everybody's doing good tonight.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about. What do you do professionally? I know me and you've had kind of conversations before about. Uh, I believe you do tech work.
Yeah, I'm somewhat of a independent freelance consultant right now as far as IT and tech type issues. I've worked in the past in helping people put together websites. I've worked in the past in designing graphic design type work. I've worked in marketing for a little bit. I've done quite a few different types of things, but in the background of all of that, I've kind of been something of an armchair investigator as far as government corruption and waste and malfeasance, if you will.
Absolutely. And just to let you know, if I do win the lottery, like we talked about, I'm definitely gonna hook you up with some cash. Okay.
I'll be flying down to Wisconsin. We're gonna start the independent investigation. Going into turning up
Right.
some of the evidence that they're you know
And I want to make a correction. I made a video last night. I know you've been extremely busy. You haven't had a chance to watch it, but I want to make a correction. To my knowledge, I believe when I was talking about the judges that Laura and I went in front of for the appeal on Brendan's case, I referred to it as the Ninth Circuit, and I think it was the Seventh Circuit. So, uh, just to correct that video from last night, um, and also want to let everybody know that if I fall out of my chair, don't worry. It's just some new medication that I'm taking, so it's gonna be okay. But look, being that you didn't get a chance to watch my video last night, Thomas, we're going to lead off and we can just kind of go freestyle. It don't have to be structured in any type of way. So, just to give you a quick rundown of my video last night, I talked about how, with three particular judges, Laura, in my opinion, even though I believe she is a great attorney, I believe that she 100%, believes in Brendan Dassey and she's going to keep fighting for him, and she has. However, in front of Judge Sykes and Judge Kane and Hamilton, when that hearing was about to wrap up, they asked her questions, and I thought she could have done a lot better job. I think she dropped the ball with her answers. And just to give you a quick rundown of what I said, when Sykes was basically telling her that, well, you're wanting us to legislate from the bench, and you could tell her voice was very shaken.
She got choked up. Yeah.
Yeah, very a lot. And I thought that one, with Sykes, I didn't think that was a battle she could have won. So even if you just want to chalk that up and say, okay, well, let's just let her go and let me try to convince these other guys. But when Kane asked her, why did the cops need two killers? What was their motive? Why did they need two killers? She started down the road of saying that the test doesn't direct us, and he cut her off and said, I know it doesn't direct us, but I'm asking, why did the cops need two killers? In my opinion, Thomas, she should have said, well, because the answer that she gave wasn't sufficient. And she did not say that, look, the reason why they needed Brendan Dassey's confession is to take Stephen Avery's alibi and flip him and turn him into a witness for the state. What are your thoughts on or in any information that you have on Sykes and Hamilton? And Hamilton, his little laugh at the end of him grilling Laura about the shell casings in the garage, that really got me hot. And me and
Rather
you,
unprofessional for a
yeah, right.
sitting judge hearing a case
So
in which
let's start with
numerous-
Sykes, if you don't mind. Tell us anything that you have researched and found out about Judge Sykes, because I can't stand her particular. She, um, I I just don't like her. Not necessarily because of her professional opinion on the case, but her attitude in general.
In the words of Barb Toddick, that if they're all in cahoots, that this is dead in the water. I believe that her suspicion was correct. That in fact they are all in cahoots. In those words, the Seventh Circuit with the state of Wisconsin and with these various elements of government at the city, county, state level. I believe that there was a lot of collusion in terms of the state of Wisconsin with the Seventh Circuit, and the point person for that was Diane Sykes. She was somebody who came out of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, so came out of the Wisconsin justice system. She's a native, I believe, of Wisconsin. I can't place my finger on exactly where she's from, but what I find most interesting about her and about the Seventh Circuit's hearing the case is the fact that Luke Berg, who presented the state's side of the case, was in fact a former clerk to Diane Sykes. He had clerked for her while she sat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, I believe as an associate justice, and that is a disturbing, a kind of an unsettling connection for the lawyer hearing one side of a case to have this kind of professional relationship with one of the judges who is hearing the case that he's presenting.
Absolutely.
I do suspect that Diane Sykes was probably connected to many of the individuals involved in this. She was attending Marquette at the same time, during the same time period as Kratz and as Norm Gahn, as well as Michael Greisbach, and along with Mark Fremgen, who was in fact Brendan Dassey's attorney in 2007, and he was the same attorney who appeared to be quite cozy with the state. He was having all kinds of conversations with Kratz outside of the courtroom, and he, of course, made the decision to cut the tape off, stipulated with the state that the tape of Brendan's interrogation would not be played in full. And in fact, it was cut off before they could see that now infamous interaction between Brendan and his mother, where he says immediately recants the story that he had been essentially had been coerced to tell. He immediately recants it. She asks, "Did you do some of those things? Did you really?" And he says, "Not really." And then he says, "They got to my head." And of course, as we all saw, that the state had stipulated with Mark Fremgen that part of the portion of the tape would not be played. And Fremgen, Sykes, Greisbach, Kratz, and Norm Gahn all attended Marquette during the same time period in the 80s. And I find that very unsettling, let's just say. It doesn't necessarily prove that there's a connection, but there was certainly an opportunity for Diane Sykes to have a long-standing relationship with individuals who have been involved in this case. And I found I would tend to agree with what you said about Laura Nyrider. She had seemed to be more interested in pursuing the case from the constitutional angles, which of course is a major portion of it, but she was not as prepared perhaps to deal with the evidentiary angles, which really would have had a major role in that would have been an important part of discrediting the statements that were attributed to or were placed in Brendan Dassey's mouth. She had, as Zellner pointed out, she could have pointed out there were shell casings all over the Avery property. There were shell casings everywhere. In fact, Fassbender admitted that on the stand in 2007, had admitted during Avery's trial that, we found shell casings and stuff everywhere. So she could have easily referred to the transcript of that portion of his testimony as a means of discrediting the seeming corroboration provided by David Hamilton's shell casings. But David Hamilton in particular has long-standing kind of relationship with the U.S. power structure, going to the very highest levels of the United States. He was a nephew of Lee Hamilton, and Lee Hamilton, of course, was he was an advisor to the Department of Homeland Security's advisory committee. He was an advisor to the Army intelligence for a long time. He was an advisor to the CIA for a long time. He's a big time DC politician. He's connected to all kinds of lobbies and stuff. He was in fact the vice chairman of the rather controversial 9/11 Commission. And so these were representatives of the real power in the United States. Some of these people who were on the Seventh Circuit, and through Diane Sykes, they had a representative for Wisconsin's state power structure. So I don't think that the case. I think the case was dead in the water, and that as Barb Toddick said, that they were all in cahoots. The Seventh Circuit with the state of Wisconsin, with Brad Schimmel, and possibly higher than that.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that for 1 second. My issue was, and you can say many different reasons as to why, whether it was because she was a rookie or whatever, but I just really felt like her voice was so shaken and she dropped the ball on some of those questions. But it's interesting to note that, in some cases, maybe it wouldn't have even mattered if she had answered those questions how people would have wanted her to, because that's something I learned just now. Me and you talking before we went live was the guy that Schimmel put up to argue for the state. I believe you said was a law clerk for Sykes. Isn't that what you said? I mean, that's
exactly it.
That's very interesting, and that's why I love having you on my channel, and every single person that watches Mysteries of Manitowoc, believe me when I tell you, they really enjoy your videos. Just to get off track for a second, I'm sure your schedule hasn't allowed you to do so, but have you gave any more thought about making your channel yet?
I've actually been planning some things for a channel, so I will be giving people an update on that soon. I just, as you said, I haven't really had the opportunity to be very much involved in the case in the past few days on any of the groups or anything like that. So I've always found my focus in this case has been kind of drawing connections between these different individuals involved and their own connections to these types of bodies like Marquette University and to the both the Democratic and Republican parties in Wisconsin, which are both just completely steeped in corruption and have been for many, many years. And
well, that's really all over the country. All of them, the Democrat, Republicans.
Absolutely.
You might have one or two, and you would be hard pressed to find one or two in most cases, but that's all of them. They're all in cahoots. I mean, one thing I do want to caution though is, like, typically people say, well, this person has a connection to this person, and this person has a connection to this person. And I'm not referring to anything we just talked about, but it's just because when you're in a profession, for instance, and let's say my line of work and in your line of work, I might have connections to a whole bunch of people.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I might have a connection to the customer, which, for instance, right now, the job I'm working on, I have a connection to the customer. I have an obligation to the company that I work for. I have all of these connections, but that doesn't mean that there's a conflict of interest. So in a lot of these cases, there are a conflict of interest, but a lot of people, that's their main argument is, well, this person knew this person and this and this and that. And that's, obviously you could see that they were colluding together. And I was thinking about that today. So I just wanted to get that out there, because just because somebody knows somebody, like you just alluded to, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a conflict of interest. But needless to say, these are interesting things that need to be looked into, because in most cases, you don't even want the appearance of a conflict of interest.
Exactly.
And which is head scratching as to why, if you have a case of this magnitude in the spotlight, you would think they would have taken every precaution necessary to keep Manitowoc and anybody else involved in the conflict of interest completely out of it. And they did the exact opposite. And that's just one thing that blows my mind.
It just seems like everywhere the entire investigation has been defined by a conflict of interest. I mean, And as Rohrer said that, and Kratz later echoed this, that that exactly as you said, that ideally they would want to avoid the very perception of a conflict of interest, and yet they did the exact opposite at every turn. And I think that investigating the mysteries of Manitowoc as we have been, we find repeatedly that people and places and things are much closer than you would expect them to be. You find, for example, that in the first case that we looked at, Ricky Hochstetler, which I'm sure we'll be coming back to at some point, his sister Nicole later ended up marrying the friend, boyfriend, some kind of person who was involved with Carmen Boutwell, who was the second case that we kind of touched on.
Right.
And the Gary Cree was his name, the guy that Manitowoc County ordered to not to talk to Carmen Boutwell, not to have any contact with her, ordered Gary Cree to stay away from her, or ordered Carmen rather to stay away from Gary. His connection to her has never really been explained or elaborated on. In fact, I think I mentioned last time that I've heard other people say that Carmen herself was gay, so that would raise even further questions about what type of association this was. But all that we know really is that Gary Cree was kind of a repeat convict, had been repeatedly brought in for various violent offenses, assaults, burglaries, fraud, all kinds of things. And he had later gotten out, and he had actually escaped from prison a couple of times, and yet they continued to give him Huber privileges, which is kind of like a work release where you get to leave the jail during the day, which is very uncharacteristic for repeat offenders. So that's not usually done unless somebody's interceding on their behalf, or they have big green dollars. It's not a normal occurrence for somebody like Gary Cree to be granted Huber privileges. So that itself was interesting to me at the time, and I find it very interesting just from a level of this is bizarre that Gary Cree later marries Nicole Hochstetler, who of course is Ricky's sister. That's just two of Manitowoc's mysterious deaths directly connected by marriage. That's just too weird.
And I want to, while you're on that, and this wasn't part of the plan, but like I said, this is freestyle. It don't matter. So while we're on the Hochstetler, foul play, I don't know if you remember one of our last episodes, we talked about there was rumors going around that Miss Debbie had a letter from somebody, maybe anonymous, that had the answers to the death of her son. That foul play has spoken with Debbie, and they did a video, a podcast about it. And so I just want to make corrections anytime. And on my channel, Thomas, like I spoke to you earlier about, and a lot of other people's channels, they just don't want to admit it. If we bring up a topic and we are giving our opinions on the topic, that's what it means, is opinion. Now, if I'm going to represent something as a fact, then I will say this is a fact. For instance, I can confidently say, after speaking with experts and from my own experience, Item FL was factually shot through the damn wall of the garage. Right. Now, you can make an argument, did it go through her first, whatever. You can go way out there on a limb and believe that if you want to. I'm just telling you, judging by what they have showed us, that bullet went. So
absolutely.
If we're gonna state facts, we'll let the viewers know. But this is opinion based, because if we had all the facts and the answers, we probably wouldn't even be here, because this wouldn't be an issue.
In so many cases, those facts and answers have been deliberately hidden or destroyed. Right. Or the evidence that would lead us to those answers. I mean, like the thousands of DCI files that remain classified, despite the fact that they claim that they've figured everything out and the case is solved, and yet thousands of their own files remain under lock and key. They have deliberately destroyed evidence. I believe I found it very suspicious that, in fact, when Peg Lautenschlager stepped down and J.B. Van Hollen stepped into place, that in fact J.B. Van Hollen immediately began trying to clear the DNA backlog at the state crime lab, and that could have easily, I thought, could have served as a cover for the destruction of physical evidence. And of course, we know that the burned human remains that were that were found in the gravel pits area, what was initially identified both by police and by the forensic anthropologist as being human remains, that those were destroyed, that those were released to the Halbach family, who then destroyed them. And so we do have the evidence that would assist us in obtaining those answers being just systematically and repeatedly destroyed. So that's part of why this search for answers is difficult, and why we have to rely so much on opinion is because the material that would aid us in basing our speculation and on firmer ground, though in many cases that has been made unavailable to us. So
Right. And that's the thing, anytime that something is said, and I when we did talk about it, we didn't mention it as fact. We said that there was rumor, speculation, whatever. So I just want to make people aware of that. Now, another issue or topic we was talking about earlier, and it's kind of been an issue, I would say a pretty good size issue here lately, and always has been the RAV4. Okay. I want to, and like I said, don't, and I know you're not, you're going to speak your mind regardless, and that's what I want you to do. You don't have to think one way or another. Nobody is going to bash you for anything, any of your opinions. I am interested in hearing your opinions on what you think about the RAV4, or maybe theorize about both possible scenarios. Because a lot of people think there's one, but there is a large portion of the make and murder community that thinks there's two RAVs. I've looked into this. I made a video on it. I'm in the middle. I'm not convinced. However, like we alluded to earlier, it was listed and mentioned almost every single time as light blue, a bluish green, and I'm sorry, green. It was mentioned dark green.
Dark green, yes.
Right, exactly. So give us your thoughts and opinions on this. And if you do have something that is factual to back up some of the things you're saying, then feel free to let that out there too.
Well, we certainly know that the state of Wisconsin has refused access to the RAV, and I think that's one of the few things that we can say for sure is that the state has made every attempt to obstruct a forensic examination of the vehicle that they have in custody. As to whether the vehicle that they have is the same vehicle that Teresa was driving prior to her disappearance, I'm up in the air about that one as well, and that's partly because just about everything, there's so much evidence that goes in opposite directions as far as that goes. I see that the VIN number has been employed as one of the most kind of compelling points for it being her RAV, that people bring up that the VIN number matched. But recently I discovered that in fact that there's a criminals have this practice of tampering with VIN numbers and actually placing fake VIN numbers on cars. They've been found doing that. There's actually kind of car theft operations that employ this means of taking a VIN number from another vehicle and then kind of placing it or kind of applying it to another vehicle, so as to break the chain and make identifying it more accurately more difficult. I mean, you can look up how they do that, but when I saw that, I was like, well, that takes out a major piece of that means that the VIN number doesn't necessarily prove to us which vehicle that it was. And as to the color issue, I recently saw the Calumet photos that were released a couple of months ago. They appear to show the RAV in the sunlight. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but it does look green. It looks like it looked in that picture of Teresa. Now is that the RAV that they found in the Avery yard? That's obviously implied to be. If it is, then it would tend to support that argument that it changed its color based on the lighting conditions and such. But I do just find it very interesting, very strange, very bizarre that every witness, excluding Stephen Schmitz, every witness described it as dark green prior to its discovery on November 5th, and that includes Karen Halbach.
Exactly.
That includes Karen, and Karen lived within sight of Teresa. Karen lived within sight of Teresa, so this is a vehicle that she would have seen almost every day. And so I find the fact that she described it as dark green to be very significant. You would think that she would have seen it in different lighting conditions, and she could have spoke to whether it was bluish green, as Pam later said on her phone call. But of course, you also have Avery also said that her vehicle was always the same every time he saw it. It was always the same, dark green. You have the missing posters, which of course were produced by a consortium of individuals. Ryan, Scott, Mike was involved in that. So the couple of her sisters were involved in that. So you had basically all of the friends and family, and everybody involved who had seen that vehicle were all in agreement as to the color, as to it being dark green. Everybody, with the exception of Stephen Schmitz. And of course, I've always had issues with Stephen Schmitz's account. I don't know exactly what his role, what the extent of his involvement could have potentially been, but I just found it strange, for example, that he was able to so accurately describe, or not accurately is the wrong word, but to specifically describe the clothing that he remembered her wearing down to the summer jacket. It just sounded like a very strange, very rehearsed account for a guy who was had met this woman for just a couple of minutes and stuff. And Stephen Schmitz, of course, is alleged to be directly related to Todd Schmitz, who was involved in Lautenschlager's campaign in Fond du Lac. It was served with her on the Fond du Lac County Board. Was involved in. She produced Todd Schmitz as a witness in when she was accused of using her state vehicle to attend campaign events. So if in fact that family connection did exist, I've never seen it exactly specified whether they were brothers or cousins, but I have heard repeatedly that there is some type of a connection between the two of them, and that would of course raise many questions as well as to whether it's a coincidence that Teresa was in Fond du Lac County that day for her first appointment, attending this appointment with Schmitz in a neighborhood that was known to be a hotbed for Wisconsin's political elite. That's if you look at the people in Fond du Lac County, that's another thing I wanted to bring up. I know I'm going all over the place again,
No,
but yeah,
you good, brother.
yeah, it's kind of like you look at the notable residents of Fond du Lac County, and you see just not only Lautenschlager, but you just see a laundry list of Republicans and Democrats in Wisconsin, as well as top business people and top. It's kind of a major hotbed for the political elite in the state, and so it's interesting to me that that was her first appointment that day. It's also interesting to me that they showed such little interest in him. I'm not suggesting anything as to him being directly involved in the commission of anything, but I just find it interesting that they didn't even request to meet Stephen Schmitz. They just had him. They just interviewed him over the phone, and that was good enough. They didn't have him provide any paperwork to verify the timing of this meeting. I don't believe. At least not initially. And of course, Schmitz was actually selling the vehicle that he had her photograph. He was doing that on behalf of a man named Craig Sippel, Sippel, and they were jointly selling the vehicle together. We're not talking about the RAV here, of course. We're talking about Teresa's first appointment, Stephen Schmitz
Right.
and Craig Sippel. And I find it interesting that Craig Sippel did exactly what Gilters like to say that Stephen did. Craig Sippel called Auto Trader and said, "I'm selling a vehicle for a man named Stephen Schmitz." Now, by Gilter logic, Craig Sippel essentially impersonated Stephen
Lured.
Schmitz.
And lured because he used a different name. So
Right. It's
yeah.
And so that's an important point to remember is that in fact Craig Sippel did exactly what Stephen Avery is accused of doing, luring by the use of a different name. And I find it very interesting as well that Craig Sippel, may in fact it would be quite a stunning coincidence if in fact he is related to Lieutenant Kelly Sippel, who of course was with Calumet County and was one of the agents, one of the police agents who first noticed the cremains on Avery's property. That was very interesting to me that Kelly Sippel had the exact same surname as Craig Sippel, and that there is a Sippel funeral home in New Holstein, and that Sippel funeral home has a branch in Fond du Lac. So that's interesting. I don't necessarily know whether there is a connection there. Like you said earlier, you do get into this 6 degrees of separation where you really can really draw all kinds of possible inferences by way of the connections that people have. But I mean, again, we have repeatedly in this case people, places, and things being closer than you would expect them to be. If in fact Kelly Sipple is related to Craig Sipple, then we have yet another one of these appointments being directly linked to individuals with police connections. Of course, the second appointment was the Zipperers, or the third appointment, if you go by early reports. I mean, that's never been clear exactly whether it was her second or third appointment. You had Teresa going to George and Jason Zipperer's place, and the Zipperer residence was connected via public listings to major figures in law enforcement, including Jean Couché. Jean Couché was, of course, the sketch artist who played a very pivotal role in framing Avery for the '85 assault. And he was living with a woman named Diane Shimek, Shimek, and Sue Shimek, actually, Sue Shimek. There was a woman named Diane Shimek who actually was a member of the Zipperer family, and she had actually she had actually said that she suspected George's involvement in the crime. So you have a possible connection between the Zipperer residents and the individuals that were involved in the '85 cover-up, specifically Jean Couché. You also have members of the Zipperer family connected to the Kocourek family. And in fact, many people do not know that Thomas Kocourek was in fact a cousin of Dave Remacher, which automatically should have disqualified David Remacher from having anything to do with the investigation. And yet he was one of the top guys on Avery's property overseeing the whole search. He was David Remacher was the first officer on scene, really, because he was the one who first responded to Pam Sturm's quote unquote discovering the RAV. He was the one who appeared there and verified the VIN number and such. And so that brings us back around to the car, is that the first officer to come and verify that it was in fact Teresa's RAV, the first officer to tell us that, to give the rubber stamp of approval for this impending search warrant, is an individual who was directly related to one of the named defendants in Avery's lawsuit. And I think that is very significant, and it's also significant, of course, that individual is also on hand when the bullet is discovered 4 months later. And item FL, of course, as you mentioned earlier, definitively proven to be fired through wood. And Dave Remacher, if you look at the family background there, they were related through two aunts, Arlene Zipperer and another woman named Zipperer. And those women were in fact related to the same Zipperer family. And I believe that there was a marital connection there. So Thomas Kocourek and Dave Remacher are not only relatives, but they're related through Zipperer sisters. It's the Manitowoc. I saw somebody say on Reddit, you have the Twilight Zone, then you have the Manitowoc Zone. It's like it's just a very strange, interesting place.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I've been trying to dig up, not necessarily dirt, but just information on Kocourek for a while, and it's not as easy as I thought it would be. I wanted information on when he became sheriff, before he became sheriff, and things like that. And he's a person that doesn't have a ton of information online. Have you found anything? I know me and you had talked about it one time. Have you found anything interesting with Kocourek? I mean, far as prior to him becoming sheriff?
Yes, in fact, I've found something that I find very interesting as to Kocourek's career in law enforcement. He actually his career in law enforcement began with the Manitowoc Police Department, and he had started in the Manitowoc PD under Elmer Schurer, Scherer, and Elmer Scherer was first cousin to Dolores Avery. So it's interesting, in fact, that Koccourek's boss in the Manitowoc PD was Dolores' cousin. You wonder if in the twisted kind of world of deep politics and the kind of connections that existed between the Avery family and members of law enforcement, whether in fact there could have been some bad blood there between Kocourek and his boss and possibly the Avery family by extension. But I found it very interesting that Kocourek began his law enforcement career. Before that, he was a real estate agent. I think he was even in real estate simultaneously while he was ascending through the ranks in law enforcement. He was also running his own independent real estate type business, but he had been directly under subordinate to Elmer Scherer, who was a member of the Avery family, first cousin of Dolores. So that definitely caught my eye. But
All right. Well, this is which I don't mind at all, and I know the viewers don't. But this specific topic, Mike Greisbach, you have been sharing a lot of information about this guy, and I want you to take your time. You're not. I'm not. Nobody's wanting you to shut up. Put it that way. So you can take your time. I want you to explain some of the things we've been discussing about Michael Greisbach, and get all of the information that you have on this guy.
All right. Well, Mike Greisbach, of course, is best known to people involved in this case through his books that he's published. The Innocent Killer, which is a book on the 85 case, and the follow-up to that, which would have been Indefensible, a book that came out soon after the release of Making a Murderer. And he functioned the book, both the book and as well as Greisbach through his various interviews, functioned as an integral part of the public relations campaign waged by the state of Wisconsin in response to the effects of the documentary and the outcry that followed the release of Making a Murderer. Greisbach gave numerous interviews to various TV shows and radio shows declaring Avery's guilt. This was a individual who sat on the advisory board of the Wisconsin Innocence Project, and in fact the Wisconsin Innocence Project later distanced themselves from Greisbach's statements on the case. They actually said that they did not endorse certain things that he had said regarding Dassey's statements. They said that he downplayed the frequency of false confessions that he had really that he had downplayed the significance of Manitowoc's involvement in Avery's investigation, and so they actually said that they did not endorse Greisbach's statements, and in fact referred to his statements as unfortunate. But that did not deter Michael Greisbach. He continued doing numerous interviews to try to tell anybody who would listen that Avery and Dassey were as guilty as sin, and he introduced himself always, or would have the hosts introduce him, as an individual who was deeply involved in Avery's being cleared for the 85 assault of Penny Bernston. And that, of course, was supposed to lend him some kind of credibility as, well, this was Avery's advocate. Why now would he be saying that he was guilty, unless, in fact, he was absolutely positive that that was the case, convinced by definitive evidence. And yet there is really no evidence whatsoever that Greisbach had anything to do with Greisbach with Avery's exoneration. There's no evidence of that. There's no documents that show Greisbach was involved in having the hair tested. There's no evidence showing that Greisbach was involved in the process of looking at the exculpatory evidence that Vogel suppressed, such as Kathy Sang's interviews, such as the canvassing of the neighborhood, where everybody said that they had not seen Avery on that beach, but they had seen other suspicious individuals on that beach. There was no evidence at all connecting Greisbach to Avery's 85 case directly, to helping Avery in any way. The extent of his connection to the case is that he sat on the Wisconsin Innocence Project at the same time that they took the case. That's it. But he has used that as a foundation for claiming to be some type of whistleblower, as Linda has said, he really, I believe, Greisbach has had a much more significant role in this operation than the public knows about. I believe that he may have, in fact, been part of this group that was involved at the county level in thinking about how to respond to this lawsuit somehow. How to pull off some kind of dirty trick to get rid of the lawsuit. I believe that Greisbach and his brother William Greisbach were possibly among the parties who were very threatened by this. Now, I base that in part on the fact that Michael Greisbach has a strange connection to various individuals who have been brought up as suspects in this case. And now, as we've discussed before, I don't necessarily think that all of the people that have been brought up as suspects were guilty of, committing the actual murder, but I do believe that many of them may have been involved in some capacity in a larger operation, that many of them may have had some involvement. You break it down to why have these people's names come up? Why have they been implicated? It's because in many of their cases, Scott Toddick, Bobby Dassey, Ryan, we have evidence that really proves that they were not telling the truth about their movements and actions that day. And you have a large number of people really whose statements have been brought into question. And as Linda said, his brother, in fact, Michael Greisbach, his brother was Judge William Greisbach. And now I find it, I wanted to get in before I even get into Greisbach's connection to several of the individuals who have been implicated by researchers as potential suspects or potential facilitators in this operation. I'd like to bring up his connection and his brother's connection potentially to the Gregory Allen situation, which of course we've discussed before. As I think that was that what really a lot of what they were covering up was the fact that they had systematically protected, city officials, county officials had systematically protected a violent rapist. And you can speculate as to why, in fact, they were doing that, whether he was, in fact, some type of informant, whether, in fact, he was part of this club. I have my own ideas on that. But needless to say, that would have not only presented a financial incentive for them to stop this lawsuit in its tracks, it would have also prevented a criminal incentive for them to do so, because, in fact, if it had come out that officials had knowingly protected this guy and allowed him to commit other violent acts, then you would have seen a call, at least. I'm cynical that anything is ever done to these people, but you would have seen a lot of people in Manitowoc and in Wisconsin would have been calling for these people to have gone to prison, if it could have been proven that they had protected Gregory Allen. Now, of course, one of the elements to what happened with Gregory Allen is that repeatedly all of these instances in which he was arrested for assault or for burglary or for following, he was peeping in homes, he was following teenage girls down the street, he was stalking people, he was harassing people. He actually was harassing Penny Bernstein after the assault, was making calls to her home. And nothing seemed to touch him. I think he once even punched a police officer in the face, and Vogel still let him off for that one too. So it's find me a person who can get away with punching a cop in the face. I mean, that's but William Greisbach, who of course is Michael Greisbach's brother, was older brother, was a judge in Brown County. He was acting district attorney as for a time period in Brown County. Michael Greisbach, of course, was this major figure in the Democratic Party in Wisconsin's as far as the law enforcement goes. He was a big Democratic power broker there. His which is interesting, since the rest of his family, a lot of them are in fact part of the Republican power structure. So of course you see how, again, how these parties are kind of like a false dichotomy or a false dynamic, that in fact many of them are just connected to the same, cliques of power, but what to get back on track, at the time, Gregory Allen is repeatedly given this unusually lenient treatment. Michael Greisbach is a district attorney, and William Greisbach is a judge. And so these individuals in the Greisbach family are very much involved in the power structure of Wisconsin and of Manitowoc County. William Greisbach was a judge and was an assistant district attorney in Brown County at the time when Gregory Allen was finally taken into custody there in 1995, late 1995. And I've always found it very interesting that his protection, the protection of Gregory Allen, abruptly stopped within weeks, really, of Avery's attorneys in the 85 case calling for, filing for those hairs to be tested, and the fingernail scrapings to be tested. It basically goes like this: that Avery's attorneys file for DNA testing, and then suddenly the authorities do something about Gregory Allen and throw him away, finally put him away, and I found that to be very suspicious timing, in the sense that I think that there was a discussion probably at some level that, let's just say that the match happened in 1995, that they were able to match Gregory Allen. There would have been a much greater degree of outrage if Allen had been loose on the streets at the time. That would have really intensified the reaction to such news. I found it so you have Gregory Allen taken into custody in Brown County and Green Bay specifically, and then you have shortly after he's taken into custody, you have these statements that are made to a Brown County detective that somebody is in prison in Manitowoc for a crime that they did not commit. That this inmate in Brown County had in fact taken credit for an assault that had occurred in Manitowoc. And you have the Brown County authorities relaying that information to Colburn, who relays it to Kocourek, and the entire upper echelon of the Manitowoc Sheriff's Office just elects not to do anything about it. And what one of Avery's civil attorneys referred to as a conspiracy of silence, which I think is a very accurate way to put it. Now, I find it very interesting circumstantially that William Greisbach is a judge in Brown County, or rather, I'm sorry, he later became a judge. He was a district attorney in Brown County, so even more contact with law enforcement at the time when Allen made these statements to a detective there. And at the same time, Michael Greisbach is not only an assistant district attorney in Manitowoc County, but he has a close professional as well as personal relationship with Andy Colburn. He's mentioned that in his books. He said that in interviews. He had a close relationship with the guy that got the call from Brown County, and his brother is sitting there in regular contact, professional contact every day with detectives from Brown County. So I find it very, very difficult to believe that Michael and or William Greisbach did not have some degree of knowledge of that 95 call. I believe that they knew about it, and I can't prove that, but I think that they were in exactly the right positions and knew exactly the right people to be able to know about that 95 call. And if in fact Michael Greisbach did know about that 95 call, or his brother knew about that 95 call, then that would indicate that not only did Greisbach not play a role in Avery's exoneration, but he was very much responsible for Avery's being in prison for 8 years, that he didn't have to be there. 8 years that, that confession could have been investigated, and wasn't, because everybody just agreed to keep quiet about it. And so I also find it interesting, kind of bolstering that suggestion. I find it interesting that when sorry, my cat's kind of yelling at me in the back.
You're good. Go ahead.
I find it interesting that that when Mark Rohrer was being deposed in the lawsuit, that Avery's civil attorneys questioned him. Why was none of the information that you had provided? I'm sorry, I got to let him out of my room.
Go ahead. Luckily, I don't own any cats or dogs. I don't have time for them.
I'm sorry about that.
Oh no, that's absolutely fine, Thomas.
He had when Mark Rohrer is being deposed for Avery's lawsuit, they ask him, did you provide the memorandums and the reports concerning the 95 call to the Attorney General's office in 2003 when they were doing their internal review? And Mark Rohrer says that he did in fact do that, and they ask him when he did that and who did that exactly, and he said, well, myself and Mike Greisbach did that when we passed all of that information to the Attorney General's office in Madison. And Avery's attorney says, well, none of that stuff is in there, and he did not appear to have any substantive response to that. And not only, I would love to have the full deposition tapes. I think that should be definitely something that we push for in the future, is to get the full tapes of those depositions, because just based on the demeanor of Rohrer and the others, it just they all look very much very uncomfortable, and the small excerpts of those tapes that we have seen did not look good for them at all. So I think that there's more to discover there, but the point being is that Michael Greisbach was one of the individuals responsible for passing the information about Avery's 85 conviction and all of the events around it, including the 95 call. He was one of the individuals responsible for that, and that 95 call that potentially, if in fact Michael and or William Greisbach had information about it, could potentially link Greisbach to the cover-up. That call is just conspicuously missing from the package that he and Rohrer are giving to the Attorney General's office. As Crockett Thompson says, I agree that I suspect that Greisbach and Rohrer were both involved in making sure that information was not included in that package, so that the Attorney General's office would not have to deal with it, would not have to explain that away. And I find it very interesting as well that the first judge to hear Avery's civil lawsuit, and he was actually hearing it for a while. They were in depositions, and he was presiding over it. Was William Greisbach. He was the guy that was hearing the civil lawsuit that Avery had filed until his brother testified. When Michael Greisbach testified, they obviously had to get William off the case, just because that looked too dirty,
Right.
They had also Michael Greisbach was also, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was attending Marquette University at the same time period as Kratz and Gahn and Fremgen and Sykes and all of these other individuals who were attending at the same time period. He was part of what I called the Marquette Parade, and he had a very powerful college in Wisconsin, Marquette. It's kind of an incubator for the power elite there. Marquette, in fact, the Greisbach family has a lot close and long-standing connections with Marquette. I believe I sent you that news article that people can look up that says that the Greisbach family had 17 degrees collectively from Marquette, and it's just basically where all of the kids went, and where the father of the family, Michael and William's father, was a professor there for more than 41 years, and they were very much part of, I believe, the kind of social circle that the alumni circle that surrounded Marquette, and that would have possibly brought them in connection with all of these characters that have been involved in this case. But it's important to recognize as well, when we talk about Michael Greisbach, that this is somebody who was actively involved in the 2005 investigation during its early phases. So it's very interesting that he would try to position himself as this uninterested party who just happens to be an employee of Manitowoc and is just, I know for a fact he says that Avery's guilty, and I have no reason to lie about it. I was a friend to Avery's cause. No, this is an individual who played an integral role in the investigation and really setting the foundations for the prosecution of Avery. And I say that because on November 5th, shortly after the RAV is discovered, Michael Greisbach is working with Rohrer, drafting search warrants at Judge Fox's private residence to give the police control of the property for more than a week. And something weird happened on my end. I just lost the private chat, but that's okay. Michael Greisbach was part of conclave in Judge Jerome Fox's private residence. Also in attendance were Mark Rohrer, Mark Wiegert, Dave Remacher. There were a number of them there. So Remacher was kind of representing the Manitowoc Sheriff's Office, Wiegert the Calumet Sheriff's Office. Rohrer was there. Kratz was there. It was at this meeting that they kind of handpicked Kratz to head the investigation. And to give the Calumet District Attorney's Office and the Sheriff's Office full control, ostensibly, of the investigation. But it always struck me as very strange that you would have a meeting of that type at somebody's private residence. It just seems very kind of, it's not a good look to have all of these government and police officials meeting in secret, basically behind closed doors at the judge's home, and then they walk over to his law office, and then they're drafting up the search warrant. Like, who knows what went on in that meeting? It's not discussed in the memos concerning the meeting. It's not really discussed what they talked about, except in very vague generalities. And I think that was kind of that was kind of a picture of the cabal that was very much involved in setting this whole thing in motion. And I find it interesting that Judge Jerome Fox would be the one to draft that search warrant and author that would be the one to sign that search warrant and all search warrants that would follow that until I believe very late into the game, something in like 2006. And then, of course, it's Judge Jerome Fox who was given the Brendan Dassey trial, and consistently just functions as an adjunct for the state. And Michael Greisbach was a phone call away, as I mentioned in one of our previous shows, was a phone call away from several individuals who have been named as suspects in this investigation. He was prosecuting Scott Toddick in 1997. Toddick was, of course, in trouble for harassment and battery and damage to property in connection with his continued stalking and harassment of Constance Wellnuts, an ex-girlfriend of his. And Michael Greisbach prosecuted him and dismissed two of the charges, dismissed the charge of disorderly conduct and dismissed the charge of damage to property. And so that's very interesting. And also Toddick's lawyer in that case was Mark Rohrer. So Mark Rohrer, of course, then becomes district attorney, and Michael Greisbach and him are working hand in hand, and you find both of those characters in 1997 involved in helping Scott Toddick get out of jail free card. And then you have, and it gets better and better because the presiding judge in that same case was Patrick Willis. So I mean, quite the motley crew there. But you have Wolfgang Braun is a pseudonym that Michael Greisbach gave the mysterious German man in his book Indefensible. This is, of course, the individual from Bondule, Wisconsin. Whose wife became very suspicious that he was involved in the disappearance of Teresa Halbach. She said that he began acting very strangely around that period. She saw him. She found items of her clothing missing and burned up and cut up, and she said that she would find him sleeping in the attic of their home in the fetal position, and it was just a very marked, very severe. Very noticeable change in her in her husband's behavior right around the period of October, November 2005. She said that this person was in and out of mental hospitals, that this person had always kind of behaved a little bit erratically and had a history of kind of strange behavior, but that that escalated around the time of Halbach's disappearance. She said that he had seen something about Teresa Halbach on TV about her disappearance. This was prior to anything being found. They were still searching for the vehicle, I believe, and he just remarked very kind of smugly almost, I believe, if I recall correctly, smiled or something and said, "Oh, she's dead," and she found that kind of very unsettling.
Well,
And
I imagine she did.
she, she said that he had actually told her shortly afterward that he had been to the Avery salvage yard um, on or around October 31st, and that he told her that he had met a female photographer there and described her as quote unquote stupid. And she became very, very concerned after the disappearance. She found a hammer that had what she described as red spots on it. She found and that was in or around their property. I forget exactly where she found it. It might have been in the attic of their home. She also found a pair of yellow panties that appeared to have some type of staining on them. And the size and the staining and stuff suggested to her that it was an adult's clothing. But she reported all of this to the Manitowoc Sheriff's Office. She said, I don't know if he was involved. I just want this to be looked into. And she gets a call back from the recently deceased Dennis Jacobs. And Dennis Jacobs tells her that, we've looked at the evidence you gave us. We've looked at this pair of underwear, and we think that your husband is a child molester. That these are a child's this is a child's clothing, and she said that seemed absurd to her based on the size of what she had the piece of clothing that she had given them, and the staining on it suggested to her that these belonged to a adult woman. Dennis Jacobs really didn't budge, didn't have any kind of answer to that, and just dismissed it and said she said she told Brian McCorkle that that Dennis Jacobs told her, we have our suspect. So very open.
Okay, so she did tell somebody, because Shaz was asking.
Oh yes, absolutely. She had absolutely, yeah. She told the Manitowoc Sheriff's Office while they were investigating Avery, and while I believe at some point after Avery's arrest, that she had given all of this. She had not only told them, but she had given the pair of underwear that she had found, and the hammer, and these other items of that she suspected might be linked to the crime. She had given that to the Manitowoc Sheriff's Office, and she said that she got a call back from Dennis Jacobs, who just totally blew off her information and dismissed it. Said, we already have our guy, and further said that he firmly believed that the pair of underwear belonged to a child, which did not square at all with how she remembered that evidence. Bringing that back to Michael Greisbach, he writes about this character extensively in Indefensible. He addresses him as a pseudonym Wolfgang Braun. This guy has always been described as being a German national who came to the United States, and she says that he's been described often online as the German, but Michael Greisbach was prosecuting this guy for I believe for a burglary, and I believe for arson related crimes, or he was there was some arson type offense in his background as well, and Michael Greisbach had dismissed the charges against him, just like he had done with Tadek very shortly prior to his being released to the public, and then he went straight to his wife's residence, who was terrified of him by that point, had moved, and they had a very tumultuous relationship, let's just say, and there was elements of domestic abuse there. And she said, well, how did this guy get my address? She believed that the Manitowoc County authorities had actually provided this guy her address, which she didn't very much appreciate at all. And she had said that she wasn't even informed that he was released or anything like that. But so you have Michael Greisbach in two instances with two individuals who have been named as suspects in this case, not only involved in their prosecutions, but basically helping them by dismissing charges against them. And so, quid pro quo, these are two guys that Michael Greisbach could have hypothetically called for a quote unquote favor later on, representing this, let's just call them the Judge Fox group, all these guys that are meeting secretly at the judge's home, if these guys were worried, if these guys needed the club, as Dave Bogatka refers to it, needed a favor, maybe Greisbach could have used his position as an assistant district attorney to reach out to some certain individuals, certain members of society that he thought might be helpful in that respect. That's ask them to do some extra community service, or I think that Greisbach's connection to these two individuals, as well as to Gary Cree, is very interesting. Gary Cree was also an individual who was prosecuted on more than one occasion by Greisbach. And of course, Gary Cree, as we discussed earlier, was the individual who Manitowoc County had ordered inexplicably, because I say inexplicably because we know next to nothing about him or their association, that they had ordered him not to have any contact with Carmen Boutwell, and he, of course, had the ability to leave the jail during day hours at the time of Halbach's disappearance. And this is another individual who had a long history of violence and who was connected to certain elements of this case. So you have Greisbach involved in the lives of three different individuals who have been named at various points as suspects in this case, by citizen investigators, citizen researchers. So again, I find that very interesting as to his potential involvement in this. His book is filled with distortions. I mean, both of his books are filled with distortions. I mean, some of it is just stupid, like where he says in his first book that that they found a set of keys in Avery's house and stuff, of hers, but other elements are kind of more insidious, where he kind of omits certain facts to suggest that Brendan Dassey gave information before the police did that was later corroborated. But of course, in all of these instances that he specifies, in fact, if you look at the history of it, these details were given to Brendan Dassey by the police. And I always find that argument where they say, well, Brendan Dassey told them this, and then they went and looked here and they found this.
Yeah.
I always find that a little bit, that just absurd on its face, even if you couldn't prove. In most of these cases, in almost all of these cases, you can show exactly where the police told him point A, and then he later repeats point A. But even if you could find a place where you can argue that he told them so, we don't know that what exactly the police told him, because there are instances where the police were talking to him where there were no recordings, and if with how bad they sounded with him on the recordings, who knows how they sounded when they were at Fox Hills and stuff, and inexplicably didn't record anything, and they knew at that time that was not how you do it, that was illegal to do that with a juvenile. So that they would not have broken procedure like that unless there was a very specific reason. But of course, Greisbach in his book repeatedly tries to argue that Brendan Dassey's statements were credible, and uses a lot of omissions and distortions to do so. He also acknowledges indefensible he admits that he is a very close and longtime friend of a certain James Lank and Andrew Colburn. So this is an individual who's very close to the people who were directly involved in facilitating this operation and in manufacturing evidence. And this is also somebody who I believe was very much involved in the 85 cover-up, and along with Rohrer, functions as a kind of link between the 85 cover-up and the 05 cover-up. And I think that one of the reasons you see that Greisbach giving so many interviews and publishing these books and being very much out on the front lines for the state is the same reason you see with Kratz, is that Greisbach is very, very worried about this being investigated, and he's very worried that his own involvement in illegality is going to come to light. So I suspect that Greisbach was probably a principal figure in the operation. That's my hunch. That's my theory. I can't prove it. But I suspect that he was a principal figure in the operation against Avery. And I believe that part of that operation was, in fact, Teresa's disappearance. I don't believe that they got lucky. I never believed that.
Right. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for today, but I want to make everybody aware that tomorrow Foul Play is premiering the podcast on Item FL called The Magic Bullet at 8 p.m. I believe that's Central. And so everybody make sure you head over and check that out tomorrow. And if you're not subscribed, make sure to do so. And like, share, subscribe to this channel if you care to. And Thomas, I will definitely be getting you back on very soon, maybe a week or so. And I know everybody enjoys having you on, and I don't mind at all that you take over the show because even if I had all of the same information that you're sitting there saying wrote down, don't think I'd be able to deliver it as well. So,
Well, thank you for having me on as always, and I'm really enjoyed it. And yeah, I'm just giving everybody my kind of whiteboard of all of the connections as I've been able to lay them out to this point. Yeah, definitely we should do another of these pretty soon.
right. And that's how I picture whenever I picture your office space. I picture like 100 photos up on the wall and documents with like strings pulled from this one to that one and this and little sticky notes everywhere. Like it's like, and a lot of the viewers commented on it earlier. It's like, how in the heck does he remember all this? I'm like, I don't know. You know, it's crazy.
It really
It's so much information. It's
to me this case
it
is
all
like
in order
fever
is
dream.
crazy.
This case is like a fever dream. Manitowoc and Calumet, this whole region is just like some weird where you've entered into the twilight zone kind of, and just things are just not as they should be. It's like some kind of Lovecraftian horror, underlying this. It just really is a very very strange case, and I believe that the underlying mechanics of what happened here tell us a lot about the society that we live in, tell us a lot about the world that we live in. Because I really, like you said earlier, I don't believe that this stuff is limited to Wisconsin at all. I think
Right.
that yeah, and yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in as well. I've been keeping an eye on the chat as well. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Jamie and Christy, and thank you guys for all the kind words. And yeah, we'll definitely be back with you guys soon.
All right, and that's going to be it for today, guys. Make sure y'all have a good evening and like, share, subscribe this video, and that's going to be it.
Christy said, "Where am I from? I'm from Toronto." But yeah,
Right, absolutely, Toronto.